firearms, and freedom. Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, Episode 3. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran. Today, we've got a very special episode for you. It's brought to you by Cook's Holsters, American-made custom Kydex holsters with a 100% satisfaction guarantee. CooksHolsters.com. Now, back in Episode 2, we interviewed Sergey Solyanik, the owner of Precise Shooter, a gun store in Seattle, Washington, who's dealing with that city's new gun violence tax, and he gave us the lowdown on that situation. Well, that interview was edited for time, but it covered a wide range of topics beyond just that specific issue, including the view of gun rights in the tech community, background checks, specifically Washington State's Initiative 594, and how views on gun rights transcend traditional labels like conservative and liberal. It's a really interesting interview, which I thought you would like to hear in its entirety, so we now present to you the unedited entire interview with Sergey Solyanik of Precise Shooter. So give me a little background here. I noticed you're educated at the Moscow Institute of Technology. You worked at Microsoft, and now you're a gun guy. How does this work?
Well, I still work at Microsoft, and I think I'm amazed that you know about my school. That's great. I think education and guns are not antithetical.
Absolutely. Well, I work for a software firm here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we sell a Microsoft product, Microsoft Dynamics NAV, and I'm a developer, an NAV developer.
Cool.
So I just thought that was interesting, and it's sort of providential that I found you, because I was looking for that firearm that it seems like you're the only store that actually has them in the country, that has any left. And then I saw your name in our emails back and forth, and then I get a copy, I think it was America's First Freedom from the NRA, and there's an article about your store moving outside the city limits. And I said, I've got to talk to this guy about this. So,
yeah.
So I was just sort of reading through all of the information that the city has provided. I even sent them an email and tried to get a little information about, how they came to the estimates about how much money they expect they're going to raise. And
I can tell you that. They published this. If you look at my website, preciseshooter.com, in the library section.
Okay.
There's a bunch of references to the, interviews that city quote-unquote leaders have given to press, and they actually explain how they arrived at the estimate. What they did was they took the total number of FFLs in the state of Washington, and of course,
which is what
I don't know if you know, but vast majority of FFLs. There is about 100,000 FFLs in the United States. I can give you exact number because they're all in my database.
And there's 22. They say there's 22 inside the city of Seattle,
there's 22 inside the city of Seattle. But vast majority of FFLs aren't actually active gun sellers. They're
right.
Gunsmiths have FFLs. There's
right.
many kitchen table, as we call them, FFLs, that basically just do internet transfers.
Right.
The actual number of kind of active retail gun counters at the time of the when they just started with this silly proposal was, I think, about 5. And vast majority of them, so of this 5, there's probably more. There's probably about 8, right? So I think there was my store, there was an equally large store. The store itself is actually far larger than mine, but the size of their gun counter is the same as mine,
Okay.
called Outdoor Emporium. So they're on south side of Seattle. I am on the north side of Seattle. And then there were three really small locations. Two of them are pawn shops, and one is a gun store in theory, but it's very, very tiny. Just to give you a reference of uh, what the relative sizes mean, is that I have about 600 guns in stock
Mm-hmm.
at any given time. Outdoor Emporium has about 600 guns as well, um, and um, and then the smaller locations would have about 40, right? So
Oh,
they're
wow.
more than the order of magnitude smaller. Um, and then 600 guns in stock is not really big by any stretch.
Right.
Uh, you know, Cabela's probably has twice, three times that.
Right.
Okay, I can tell you that in the country there are 76,000 FFL licenses right now.
Right.
There's certainly nowhere near 70,000 stores.
Right.
70,000 gun stores would be swimming in them if everyone every license actually had a store. Um, anyway, so they took this very uneven space, and the rest of them were big fives, right?
Right.
So two medium-sized stores, nowhere near Cabela's, kind of similar to what we have outside Seattle, slightly smaller than many stores outside Seattle, nowhere near large sellers.
Okay.
Uh, and then three really small, and then about three big fives, which don't sell handguns, and have very, very marginal sales in general. Also, they typical big five would have about 50 guns in stock,
Gotcha.
all shotguns,
Right.
and some rifles. So that's sort of the landscape. So they took the average, basically. Then they got the number of transactions that are performed every month in the state of Washington, or every year in the state of Washington, and they divided one number by their other, getting the average quote unquote number of transactions per dealer. And then they said, okay, we'll multiply this by the 22, and that would be the number of gun sales that's happening in the store. So the analogy that I have for this is that if you take 100 people off the street, and one of them happens to be Bill Gates, and you compute the average salaries, and you say, well, it must be true that a random 10 people out of this 100 have an average income of $10 million a month. That's basically the reasoning of the city of Seattle, and this is sort of a statistics 101 thing, right? So,
Right.
and I do know that for a fact that the Seattle finance director, his name is Glenn Lee. He went to college, so he for sure he knows that this is absolute bullshit. It's actually even worse, right? So by doing this by doing this calculation, you can sort of quote unquote estimate the average, though this estimation is nowhere near correct. In the case of state of Washington, vast majority of sales are handled by large two Cabela's certainly surpassing gun sales everything that ever can happen near Seattle, right? So,
Right.
so applying that average is the same. Applying the average to everyone while having Cabela's in the mix is essentially the same as applying the average to a group of people while having Bill Gates in the mix. But it gets better, right? It gets better. So you can arrive at one number, right?
Right.
Which would be the average. Also, it's not an expected average for a subset. You cannot arrive at the interval. And if you look at what the city number says, it's from 300 to 500.
Right.
So where they get the interval, they cannot explain. Right? It's impossible. They just took a large number, and subtracted and added 100,000 to them, but they don't know, right? There is no way to actually estimate the confidence interval without knowing the distribution.
Yep.
And don't know the distribution.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting is it's that typical liberal sort of static analysis thing where you just assume that if I pass a tax, I'm always going to be able to collect that amount of money because people are always going to pay it. That it's not going to affect their behavior, and that they're not going to seek ways to avoid paying that tax.
Of course, right? Of course, and it is a that's an economic reasoning. Right, but again, just mathematically, it's pure bullshit, right? And,
exactly.
And let's not pretend that city finance department does not understand it. They absolutely do. The fact is that Burgess, the council president of the council,
right,
just went to the city and got them to lie for them, and that actually is the scary thing here. The city turns out to be so incredibly corrupt that professional wing will willingly lie for the political wing just to cover their tracks. If you look at how Burgess set it up, he did everything perfect, right? He is completely blameless. He went to the professionals, quote unquote, in the city finance and got the number from there, and then he went to professionals, quote unquote, from the city legal office, right, to the city attorney, and he got it covered there, and then they even went and picked up a judge who was sympathetic to their cause and got the judge to certify it, right? So
Judge Palmer Robinson, right?
Yes. So politically, everything has been done fantastically well, right?
Right. I thought this was very crafty because the way you avoid the state's preemption laws is you go at it through taxation and say, well, look, we have the right to tax within our jurisdiction.
Which of course is a complete bullshit, right? Because let's say this will not happen in Seattle, but let's say I am in some small city in Alabama, right? And I decide that, and let's say the community leader there decides that, we don't like books that contain swear words. You can't outright ban them because of the First Amendment, but the precedent that the judge has just created in Seattle is that you can tax them.
Right.
So let's create a morality fund and tax all the city at every sale of the book at 20 cents per swear word. That is essentially the precedent that they created legally.
Yes, exactly.
And the judge certified this, right? So of course there's no way this is going to stand on appeal the moment it gets out of the city. And you have to understand the terminology. The Superior Court of King County is the lowest court that is responsible for this, and of course it is it appears to be under complete control of Burgess and its electable position. So I imagine the standards, typical political corruption with campaign donations, which organizations will forward to the judge when it's time for her to be reelected next year, right? So the moment it gets out of here, it's going to get straightened down because there is just no way this can stand. It's the precedent is that you can use taxation as a form of regulation is just too sweeping.
Right, exactly. And now I understand Tim Burgess, the city council president, has a pretty long history of this kind of stuff. The council obviously is fairly liberal, and Burgess has a history of proposing pretty strict gun control ideas going back to to 2012, right after Sandy Hook. So this is not out of character for him. I mean, he was facing re-election. He's running as far left and as hard gun control as he can go to try and win re-election, as I understand it. But he's got this. He's been this way. This has been in his DNA for a long time.
Yeah, I wasn't actually paying attention back then, so I can't really comment. I do have to say that the reason Burgess invented this whole thing is because he was under challenge from a more progressive challenger, and he had to basically brush up his quote unquote progressive. I really don't think this has anything to do with liberal versus conservative. It's just, basically a political wing is creating fantasies for people to distract them from real issues. And real issues in Seattle we have plenty, and Seattle City Council does absolutely nothing to actually address them. We have, we actually don't have an epidemic of violence in the city, but we certainly do have an epidemic of property crime. It's going crazy. It's different neighborhoods in the city are now starting to band together to basically hire private security in forcing neighborhoods, because police will never show up would just don't show up to investigate property crimes, even when the offender is there and they're being called, they just don't show up. So
I found their numbers interesting. You mentioned that there's not really an epidemic of violence, because they mention on their website there have only been 131 firearms deaths in King County, 131 a year since 2000, or from 2006 to 2010, and 2/3 of those are suicide.
Yeah, of course. And if you actually look specifically in Seattle, what the firearms related deaths really are, you will discover that most of them are gang members shooting each other.
And those guys are not coming into your store to buy guns.
No, not at all. I've never seen one. Because they know what the result will be. They're not going to get the firearms there.
Right. And so the tax is basically taxing you as a store owner for the actions of criminals.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
It's some sort of a collective punishment, which for some reason politicians in this country consider appropriate.
Yep. Unfortunately, you're exactly right. Now, how long have you owned Precise Shooter? When did?
The current incarnation of the company is just over 1 year. Well, it's a couple of years old, but we were in operation in that particular store for just over a year.
Okay.
I had a different company, which right now, well, I still have, but we don't do. I don't really do any retail sales anymore from my home.
Okay.
That's been going on since 2012. So what happened was I really like guns. I'm an avid shooter. I'm a big collector. My favorite are former Soviet and communist bloc guns. So I have a very large collection of Mosin guns.
Oh.
And kind of similar like older Soviet and communist bloc firearms. And then I had my CNR license, but I found myself buying fairly large amount of guns, and I thought about getting an FFL, but you can't really get an FFL without actually selling guns for profit. So a few years back, I started my business. I started doing primarily transfers.
Right.
Out of the house. So like similar that I had become one of the 22 very small FFLs that don't actually have retail gun counters in the city. But I've done a lot of transfers, and at some point I started selling a lot of guns to just people inside Microsoft and the rest of Seattle's technical community. Um, and then it kind of snowballed, and I mean, there's a very large number of people in Seattle who like firearms. Um, this is why I don't really like when people partition, um, the gun attitudes to conservative versus liberal. I'm a liberal, and I have hundreds of guns. I stopped counting at about 600.
Oh.
And
Politically, that tends to be where the divide is, unfortunately.
I think it's more of a correlation than causation. There's nothing in my ideology that I would say is against gun ownership or for restriction of guns. I think what you really are observing is that the cities in cities, people don't use guns. They don't know very much about them, and they also happen to be liberals. Whereas in rural communities, people use guns for it's a tool of the trade in there, and there's a lot of places where you can go shoot. So it's sort of part of the rural culture, and rural communities tend to be conservative. So you end up with this correlation, but there really isn't much ideologically that would prevent a liberal from owning guns. And Seattle is full of liberals who really love guns. We had almost $1 million in sales in the first year, in a very liberal city.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the great things about about the gun community I've found is that it's not a monolithic group. It basically crosses all lines, whether from gender to religion to politics.
Yeah, it's, very much so. And in Seattle especially, it is very, very distributed and very diverse.
And we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more of our interview with Sergey Solyanik from Precise Shooter in Seattle, Washington, right after this. If you carry a gun for personal protection, it's imperative that you get a good holster. Now, when I started out, I had no idea what that meant, and I went through a bunch of really bad holsters. That's when I found Cook's Holsters at cooksholsters.com. Cook's holsters are custom-made to fit your specific firearm. They're available in lots of colors, including custom-printed kydex. Cook's holsters are made in the USA. They come with a 100% lifetime warranty against defects and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Visit www.cooksholsters.com and use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST, and you'll get 15% off everything in the store. Look, you put a lot of time, a lot of money into the gun you choose to carry every day. Carry it in the best holsters. cooksholsters.com.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
And welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. We continue with our interview with Sergey Solyanik from Precise Shooter in Seattle, Washington. So talk about guns and techies. That when you mentioned that a moment ago, selling to people in the tech community, that interests me because I generally, when I think of tech guys, I don't think guns.
Well, you're wrong about that, right? Because
I'm glad to be wrong about that.
Techies are, specifically engineers.
Right.
We like technical challenge. Sending a small piece of metal across vast expanses of space and getting them to arrive within, a few inches of each other is a technical challenge.
Right.
So shooting is very much a technical challenge. Guns are often marvels of engineering. They all have their own different purposes, but in the end, They perform well in given the design, given the limitations of a particular application. So yes, shooting guns is, especially creating guns is a technical challenge, and shooting guns often can be a technical challenge. I do a lot of reloading, which kind of invites a lot of statistical calculations.
Right.
So and I definitely not alone. Microsoft is full of gun owners. Guns are extremely popular in the company.
Wow. Excellent. Good to know, because I know the company is generally supportive of gun control, but it's good to know that the employees are not along for the ride with that.
I wouldn't say that the company is supporting gun control. The company does have restrictions on guns on campus. Um, Frankly, as a hiring and occasionally, very frequently, but nevertheless, firing manager, I'm not really against that, because sometimes I do have to deal with distraught people, and who knows.
Right. Well, I know the company does tend to fund certain anti-gun groups, but I don't know what the company's policies regarding guns in the workplace happens to be. But I know that they do tend to funnel some money to donate to groups that are not pro-gun.
Oh, really? I didn't know about that. Is that the company or Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer? There's
Both.
there's a difference. Uh,
Yeah, a little of both.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, Bill actually surprises me, because he is a brilliant guy,
yeah,
but his stance on funding Washington Alliance for Guns Responsibility um,
yeah,
is completely puzzles me. I think the only explanation for this is that the sum is so small that he just doesn't pay attention. He listens to people that he knows, and just gives the money.
right.
So if he spent 15 minutes on looking at their agenda and reading Wikipedia about things like assault weapon ban, for instance, I just don't see how is it possible to justify this.
Right. So talk about moving your store. What uh, you decided? One of the things that is mentioned in this article that I read from a quote from the NRA related to the judge's ruling this month was that the impact is there's going to be an impact, obviously, on buyers, because they're going to be or on businesses, because gun buyers are going to go outside the city to buy their guns and buy their ammunition to avoid the tax. So you're taking your store outside the city to avoid paying the tax.
I'm not alone. I just been by one of the smaller store that that has been um, one of the stores that had 40 guns on display. I just came by there because I had business in the city, and in that part of the city, and I noticed that they have another location, and they had a piece of paper on the door saying that we're consolidating our locations to outside the city. So I'm not the only one leaving. I think pretty much everybody who sells guns or ammunition in Seattle understands that it's impossible to do business. Which is, by the way, again, city knew that.
Hmm.
There's they don't, again. Let's not pretend that they are really expected to make money on it.
No.
They completely understand what happens. Their goal was to run gun businesses out of the city. That's what they wanted to do, and that's exactly what's happening.
Right. They can't come out and do it directly, so let's just tax you out of business.
Right. Because it simply makes it economically impossible to sell guns there. I cannot raise prices because, well, people will simply buy on the internet.
Right.
Um, and again, remember, there's just 20 tiny kitchen table FFLs who would do internet transfers for $25.
Right.
So and people sell guns on the internet almost at cost, right? There is a lot of gun sellers that are just wings of distributors.
Right.
So if you look at prices at Grab a Gun or Bud's Gun Shop, they're very, very low. The only way for me to compete with them is because there is shipping and there is this transfer fee.
Right.
But I can't raise the prices too much because people are just simply going to be buying there and doing transfers.
Right.
So for ammunition, you have SG Ammo and Lucky Gunners, and there's a bunch of places which sell ammunition cheap. Again, we make money primarily because there's shipping fees. But a cost of 10 millimeter box of 10 millimeter ammunition in my store, at the time we stopped selling it, was $10.99 a box of 50. The tax would add $2.50 to it. I was making essentially just over $1 and less than $1 if you consider credit card fees on a box. So I certainly cannot swallow any part of this 250.
Right.
I would have to pass it to the customer, and I can't because on the internet that same box of ammunition is sold for $10. So so people would simply start buying there, or they would just go and buy it at the firing range where a box of ammunition would be cheaper than what I would be saying it was the tax, was a price hike caused by the tax.
Right.
So economically, it's impossible, which is why everybody would be moving. The other store, it's harder for them. There's a big store, the Outdoor Emporium. It's harder for them to move.
Right.
But I noticed, I came by there a couple of times. There really aren't many customers there, almost none, even at busy times. And I noticed that they clearly are draining the gun collection because the shelves are getting very empty.
So it won't be long probably before they're moving as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So where are you moving? You're just moving right outside the city limit, or?
Yeah, I read the location in Linwood. It's a little bit further. It's not just outside the city limits. It's about 5 miles, I think, outside the city limits. So when I do expect that we will win on appeal, so I will have that location, and we'll come back to our current location, and the store is going to be actually well distributed.
Oh, very good. Okay, so you're not selling the existing location. You're just temporarily moving operations.
Correct. Yeah, and I think what I learned from this is that really for the company to be stable, we have to have multiple locations in different political jurisdictions, because if politicians and voters go crazy in one of them, we simply have to have a place, another place or another set of places where we were not sufficiently diversified with just one. What we're going to do is we're going to probably have about 4 locations around Seattle, and as a result of all of this. So we're going to have one south, one on the east side, one in Linwood, and when we win on appeals, we're going to reopen our Seattle location.
Very good.
So the funny part, of course, right, is that City of Seattle, this is always happening with the gun control, right?
Right.
Whatever they are trying to accomplish clearly is not working because every time they introduce some gun control legislation, it just creates more guns, effectively.
Obama is the gun salesman of the year for 7 years straight. That's true.
Yeah, he was. That actually is true. that is true. So again, let's not pretend that they don't understand it, right?
Right.
The problem is not with the politicians. Politicians are crooks. We all know that. There's just they're crooks in every party on both sides. They are
Right.
exploiting the voters. What we do need is we need voter education.
Yes.
That I think for gun owners to sort of win, and make sure that we keep our rights. We need to broaden. We need to get voters to understand how the system really works. We need to broaden the tent, which is why I think the gun stores, especially in liberal areas like Seattle, are extremely valuable because they bring us allies in the areas where previously there weren't as many.
Right.
So so I think it's important to basically increase the participation in both parties so that voters really understand what assault weapon ban is and why it has no chance of working, or take a very critical look to the quote-unquote gun show loophole. This was another interesting case, right?
Right.
We a year ago, or more than a year ago, um, this quote-unquote loophole was closed in the state of Washington. Voters overwhelmingly voted for universal background check laws.
Initiative 594.
Initiative 594, and there was absolutely no impact, none, zero.
Right.
The homicide rates were exactly the same,
Right.
right? So people need to understand this, right? One of the problems with all this gun laws is that they appeal to quote unquote common sense,
Mm-hmm.
but no one ever tracks success of these measures. No one there. And it's not like there is not enough statistics, right? There's plenty of states
Mm-hmm.
where similar background checks, universal background checks law were introduced. I picked a few of them actually. On my website. You can see an article just looking at the numbers around this. So Colorado, for instance, was one of the states that implemented background check laws a long time ago. And if you look at the dynamics of the homicide rate, it's actually this exactly. So homicide rates had been declining across the nation and actually across the Western world
Right.
in the recent several years. And they were basically all declining at about the same rate, right?
Right.
In the countries and in the municipalities and in the states that adopted stringent gun control laws,
Mm-hmm.
as in the states and in the countries which did not.
Right.
People really like to use Australia, for instance, as an example, right? But in
Right.
actual fact, if you look at the numbers, the homicide rates actually dropped faster in the United States than in Australia over the same period of time.
Right. The
And
comparison they try to make here is they compare the gun homicide as though guns are somehow, if you're killed with a gun, it's somehow worse than if you're killed some other way. And
Exactly.
What they should be looking at is violent death, violent crime in the U.S.
Exactly.
versus violent crime in Australia, and there's no comparison.
Yeah, that's exactly. And Australia is actually extremely interesting in this regard, right? If you look at the homicide rate versus firearms related homicide rate, you discover that right after the ban, the percentage of the homicides in which the firearm was used dropped by half. It wasn't really that big to begin with. It was about 20%.
Right.
And very quickly, within just a couple of years, it went down to 10.
Right.
Right. But the actual number of homicides didn't change.
Right. But it allowed the politicians to pat themselves on the back and say, "Look what we did. We decreased homicide rates by half in 2 years." But
Exactly.
it's a misleading statement of the numbers.
Exactly. So this is one of the things that I think is sorely lacking in United States in general, is that people don't do real analysis of the consequences of this law, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of appeals on emotions on every side, and and anti-guns crowd that's, oh, look, children died,
Mm-hmm.
right? So let's ban everything.
Right.
And on the gun community, unfortunately, it's so freedom, 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 right? Which sounds unpersuasive to an average user, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
children died.
Right.
But if you actually look at the number of children that died and actually sees that the number of children that are killed by drunk drivers considerably surpass the number of children killed by firearms, well, and we don't buy alcohol because of a few really bad people who drive while intoxicated.
Right.
Maybe we shouldn't also ban the guns, right? So,
Right.
we need more of an analysis of consequences of these laws to see that, well, we've already tried this and it didn't actually
Yeah.
make any difference.
It's a hard slog when we're fighting against the side that is using emotion to push their agenda. We're trying to fight with logic and statistics. It's hard to convince people, or, oh my good, like you said, oh my goodness, look at all these children who've been killed, and you're trying to say, okay, calm down, let's look at this with reason and logic. It's hard to get people to pay attention to that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't actually see a lot of numbers-based arguments, right? On,
Right.
and I think our side should just be better at that. And I think if we have numbers and we can actually go and say, but look, here's a chart. Here's actual chart in Australia, right? This is what happened. This comes from Australian Institute of Criminology.
Right.
See, no impact, none.
Right.
Right. So the same sort of thing exists for suicides. There was the drop in suicide rate in Australia did occur, but it occurred at roughly the same rate as exactly the same rate as over the same period of time in the United States.
Right.
So people always commingle suicide deaths with homicides, which I think is wrong. But even if we take that as a framework, it still wouldn't actually work.
Right. Well, overall, I see attitudes nationally shifting in our direction. That's why I think you see what is a recent poll that showed a majority of Americans do not support reinstating the assault weapons ban. You see,
Yeah, I'm very happy about that.
Absolutely.
I'm very happy about that.
I just don't think their arguments are. I think their arguments are, the American people are finally starting to see that their arguments aren't very consistent, and they're seeing the proof in the pudding that, criminals don't go to gun shows. Criminals don't buy their guns at gun stores.
Yeah, exactly. This is actually also a very important distinction, right? Because with I-594, for example, what they've done is that they created a law, and then they didn't allocate any money whatsoever to actually enforce it, and there is no process to enforce it. Forget even the money, right? Just imagine how would you enforce this law? It's very difficult, maybe impossible. Who abides by the law that is not enforced? By definition, only law-abiding citizens.
Right.
So these were the only ones who got inconvenienced with that, right? So now two friends exchanging a gun at my store, it costs them $50, $25 for the transfer fee from one friend, $25 transfer fee from the other friend, if they just are, exchanging the guns. So $50 for something that was free before, and now, and zero impact on anything else.
Right.
Zero impact on anything else. It's amazing.
It doesn't make any sense. The fact that they didn't allocate any money for enforcement tells you what the ultimate goal was, and it was really just to create another hindrance for law-abiding gun owners. It wasn't really to accomplish anything in terms of violence reduction or actually to protect people from quote-unquote gun violence. It was really just to create another stumbling block.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
It's
sir.
mhm.
Well, it's been this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and do the interview. I really hope that the move goes well and that you do gangbusters business outside the city limits, and
Well,
that the expansion goes well.
enormous amount of mails that we get are of the sorts, we're just waiting for you to move. We're ready to buy our next gun.
Where can they? All right, so they can find you online, and they can still buy from you online, I assume.
Yes, if you are outside the state of Washington, we certainly sell you firearms. This do not the tax does not apply to any of the sales.
Excellent.
So we have a very large selection of Let's Bears and Freedom Arms revolvers. So yeah, just visit us online, and we'll be more than happy to help you.
Great, and it's preciseshooter.com, correct?
Shooter.com, yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Sergey. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure doing business with you, and it was a pleasure interviewing today. And again, I hope everything goes well with the expansion, and I hope this, on appeal, this crazy tax gets overturned and that you can get back to business in Seattle.
I certainly hope so. Thank you very much. Thank you for your support.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And that's going to wrap it up for this episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading and subscribing. I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @ArmedLutheran and like us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/TheArmedLutheran. You can contact us by email at armedlutheranradio@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 855-54-ARMED. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.